Okay, all right. Thanks, Connor. Sorry, start again. Right, we're watching a war. I think it's quite unprecedented in many ways. I mean, it's changed the whole of the world economy quite drastically. For a start, I mean, the Pentagon has offered estimates of between about 25 and $30 billion cost to the American military. The those who are in the know and observers think the actual cost to the American military is probably more like three or four times that. We've seen, also, of course, the impact across the entire economy of the Middle East. Massive impact on all the countries, especially those countries actually who technically were minimally involved. The Gulf Cooperation Council countries, many of whom were against the whole thing. The impact to the world economy is something, and probably been estimated something like two trillion or more dollars, two times 10 to the $12, um, you know, and a vast impact in terms of the economies of numerous countries, or virtually all countries on Earth, but particularly obviously those in Asia and Africa. And events like people in the actual price of oil on delivery going to I think in one case $286 a barrel on delivery to Sri Lanka, but not numbers close to that in certainly over $150 a barrel in numerous other countries. Purely accounting for the cost of moving the stuff and ensuring the moving of the stuff. You can go through the whole thing. The question really in front of us today is, does it make any sense? Is there any coherent and logical reason for this war? I mean, most wars you can work out, what the aim of the at least those who started it, in this case the US and Israel, what their aims are, and if there's a sort of logical progression. And obviously, usually there are numerous unintended consequences in any war, which cannot be controlled by those involved. But this war seems to be particularly illogical. Here we have Michael Roberts to offer us his explanation of how the thing could work, or in what the basis of it is, to which I think should be very useful. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Matthew. So I will now address the meeting about the logic of insanity. And let me start, first of all, by bringing us up to date with the military situation, as I understand it, from the news sources as of last night and this morning. Yesterday, Donald, on his Truth Social, told us that agreement was close to being made, negotiations were making fantastic progress, and it will shortly be all sorted with Iran on the question of some sort of peace deal. He didn't specify in particular what the agreement was, but of course he'll want to give the impression that Iran has agreed to his terms. At the same time, Iran issued similar messages to say, no, it hasn't. We haven't agreed to anything. We're still discussing. And we have to say that as far as we're concerned, there can't be any deal unless Iran's in control of the Strait of Hormuz, that we decide how much of our nuclear material we keep, that the US and its supporters, including Israel, of course, give us firm guarantees that they'll never attack Iran again. And we want compensation for what's happened up to now, which we can collect through the tolls that we will control through the Strait for ships going through there. This, of course, is totally unacceptable to the US. But Trump says deal will be reached. And then he said in the same breath, I think, as he stays up all night doing his Truth Social messages, that if it isn't signed up and dealt
Michael
with
Roberts
tomorrow,
speaking.
Monday,
Wow.
then once again, all hell will break loose upon Iran on Tuesday. But he said, of course, this many, many times before, and it still hasn't come to anything. So I conclude that we don't really know what's going on, but we can assume that the Americans are in some difficulty about trying to work out a deal which saves face for Trump, and yet, given the weakness that they're in position now, that they're forced to come up with a deal which the Iranians will substantially make gains from any peace deal. We're now heading towards one more week, and we'll be 3 months this war has begun. And if you remember, of course, started on the 28th of February with the assassination and attack by the US and the Israelis, the assassination of the Ayatollah and the bombing of Iran and the shocking bombing of the school kids in Iran and many other destructions of Iran. This was supposed to bring about immediate regime change with dozens of the top leaders wiped out by the attack. But unfortunately, at least for the Israelis and for the US, Iran is not Venezuela. And capturing or killing the leader did not bring submission by the Iranians at all. And they continued to fight on despite the tremendous destruction going on. We were told regularly by the defense minister Hegseth that Iran's power to fight a war had been completely and utterly obliterated, that the nuclear weaponries and reactors and areas had been obliterated. Everything had been obliterated. They had no weapons left. And yet bombs and missiles rained upon the Gulf states from Iran and on Israel as well from the Iranian forces. And according to the Pentagon, only this week, they say that basically Iran has something like 70 to 80% of all its weaponry that it had before the war started. And worse than that for the Americans and the Israelis, they've had time now to move that around and get it more sufficiently organized. And they've also got help from outside, Russia and China probably, to monitor American activity in the sky and elsewhere. So they're in many ways in a stronger position to carry out this continuation of the war. And that's why we haven't seen any action by the Americans. And regime change has totally failed. I mean, it's a policy which I'll come back to in a minute, which is increasingly the policy of the Trump administration of American imperialism. It's always been part of American imperialism's policy for regime change the leaders, get a coup, put in the people who support us, and then everything will be fine for American imperialism. Increasingly, they haven't been able to do it by coups, and we're exhausted. We're moving towards the idea of bombing and assassinating the leaders, and then replacing them, they hope, with people who matter. In the case of Iran, the Israelis want to put back the Pahlavi dynasty and the Shah's family back into power. In the case of the US, apparently Trump talked about one of the ex-presidents replacing the existing regime. None of that has happened so far and is very unlikely to happen. Perhaps more unfortunately for the Iranian people too, there is no prospect now of building a sufficient opposition against the mullahs and the military regime which existed before the war started. What this war has done, and this invasion, this attack by the Israelis and the Americans, is strengthening the regime against its own people as well, let alone against themselves. And that's one of the results I think that we'll have to bear in mind as we look at how this progresses over the next few months. But how is it going to progress over the next few months? Now, if we don't get a settlement in the next week or so, and we head into June, then we have to say that the situation economically is going to deteriorate quite fast. Already, as has been pointed out by Matthew, we have oil prices and gas prices at really peak levels, around about, just this morning, $105 per barrel for the Brent crude, which is what Europe has to pay for its oil on whole. Asian crude prices are even higher than that. It's been jumping up and down depending on whether the news item suggests a peace is in play or whether it's not. It was supposed to be in play yesterday, so it dropped down to 90.95. Today it's back to 105. Why? Because the one Iranian ship was attacked by the Americans, and the Iranians said, well, that's it. If that happens, we're going to launch attacks on everybody. So we're back in a dangerous situation. But the price remains, on the whole, around about $100 a barrel compared to $65 a barrel before this war started. So we've seen a dramatic increase in the crude oil price and also in the gas prices, particularly in Europe, where Europe depends heavily now on liquid natural gas because it's ended its relationship with Russia for cheap Russian oil and gas and relies very much on imports from other countries, mainly the US, but also other countries for liquid natural gas, which is shipped over in containers and is much more expensive to operate rather than through pipelines. So we have a situation where the price is rising. This is affecting fuel prices across the world, energy prices across the world. It's affecting regional flights too, because the bombing has meant that within the Middle East area, flying across the Middle East area is extremely dangerous. And so many flights have been cancelled as a result to avoid the risk of that. And we increasingly got a permanent global blockage of shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, which means not just for oil and gas, but also for a whole range of other products which the world economy needs, whether it's fertilizer for agricultural production, various other products which will affect chemical production, manufacturing, and so on. All this blockage continues, and we're now heading into the end of the third month since the strait has been closed. According to the International Energy Authority, if we're still in this situation as we go into July, August, we're heading into a red zone. It's not then what they mean by that. It's not just a question of prices and how high they are and how that's affecting the cost of living for people around the world, particularly the poorest countries, but also shortages, outright shortages. For people will not have enough food, they'll not have enough facilities, materials that they need to grow crops and so on. This would mean a dramatic a fall in demand. The economists, mainstream economists, like to call it demand destruction. They talk about price rises, then we move into a period of demand destruction. What they mean basically is slump. What they mean is starvation for many people around the world, and also generally a complete decline in the ability of people to get basic necessities and commodities that they need to make live. And that's going to particularly hit the poorest countries in Asia, in Latin America, and elsewhere, but particularly in Asia, which depends upon the flow of produce through the Middle East in order to receive their imports that they require. And then, in a general sense, what this means as we continue in this situation, even if the war was ended in the next week or two, it would still be the case that prices would have already started to feed through from raw material prices, energy prices, into the wider areas of prices in the shops and in utilities and so on, so that we're going to see a sharp increase in utility prices, electricity and gas prices, which will remain high. The oil price is likely to stay around $100 for a long time hence, and that's going to impact across the inflation rates for all the major economies. We're talking about an increase where the major economies before this war started, by that I mean the top G7 economies and a few of the other OECD economies in Europe, Japan, North America, inflation rates were not down to the level that supposedly they're supposed to go to, 2%. They're around about 3% or slightly higher in most of those countries. Now we're talking about, in the case of the UK, which is probably the hardest hit because it imports so much of its energy rather than producing it itself. We could see, according to the Bank of England anyway, we could see inflation at the end of this year, even if the war ends in the next few weeks, at 6%. That's their worst scenario, and I think it's a scenario that's more likely than being the worst scenario. The UK has got the highest electricity prices in the world, Partly that's because they price it off the gas prices, and therefore they don't price it according to all the other things that go in to source electricity, like renewables and so on. They price it off liquid natural gas or off oil. So inevitably, they're going to have a higher price level. But even if that didn't exist, they still have some of the highest electricity prices in the world. You can only imagine who's second. Second is Germany, which has inevitably resulted because of the loss of cheap Russian gas and oil in Europe and Germany's manufacturing sector has been decimated by this increase in energy prices. And this was even before this war, because of the Ukraine war had created that situation for Germany. So inflation in Germany, although the economy is struggling, it's hardly moving. It's at zero virtually. The same with France. The latest economic activity figures out of France showed a negative position as the economy is developing. Same with all the G7 economies, including Canada, including Japan, to a lesser extent the US. But even in the US, inflation is on the rise. It's now at 3.8%. And the forecast, I think, is something like 5% by the end of this year if we don't see a dramatic change in the global situation for energy and other products. And at the same time, growth rates, as I said, in case of Germany, is flat or in recession. In case of France, similar. Italy growing slightly. The UK is growing at, well, according to the latest figures, is going to grow 1% this year. I doubt it'll make even 1%, but that's the latest forecast. It's probably going to be less than that. And Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor in Britain, got very excited to tell us that we're going to grow at 1% this year. Wow. I mean, it's a staggering thought that 1% is regarded as a success now in some of the major economies. 1% in the GDP does not mean 1% increase in real terms for the average living standards of working people in Britain or in Europe or elsewhere. It's less than that because of inequalities, because prices will eat much more into the average household's income than it does for the economy as a whole. So a 1% GDP growth rate, if you take out the population that increase or the employment increase that comes from that, then the actual increase in per person is probably more like 0.5%. And as I say, probably less in some of the Central European countries, Germany, France, and so on. And that is not equally distributed. So that it means the bottom 40 or 50% of households in Europe are suffering a real decline in their living standards over the last year and going in to next year if this war continues as we see it now. So what we have, what the economists describe as stagflation. That is a stagnant economy, but with rising prices, accelerating prices. So inflation means a rise in prices, but accelerating inflation. Inflation rising faster over the next year while the economy slows down. That's a form of stagflation. Now, we haven't had that term since the 1970s, when during the 1970s, partly due to the oil crisis as well, we had a very sharp increase in prices and a stagnation in the economy, particularly culminating in the, first of all, the 1974-75 recession, and then in the 1980-82 slump, which led to the stagflationary situation. This is a situation that central banks, monetary people who are apparently so clever they can solve the management of the economy by manipulating interest rates and the amount of money that they inject into the economy, central banks are now in a completely nonplussed position. What do? Do they keep interest rates down or even lower them in order to avoid stagnation and a slump? Or do they raise interest rates apparently to cool the economy and get inflation down? Because they have the theory that if they raise interest rates, inflation will eventually come down. This has really absolutely nothing to do with inflation, in my view. What it will do is cool the economy or lower living standards. And eventually, the best way to get inflation out of an economy is to have a slump under capitalism. And that's what central banks would do if they start raising interest rates. So at the moment, what are they doing? They're sitting on their hands. They don't want to hike rates and they don't want to lower rates. But they eventually, if this war continues and prices continue to be at these levels and accelerating, then they will be forced to raise interest rates. And that will mean that will spread through the cost of borrowing in all the major economies. In the US, the mortgage rates are already at peak levels. In the UK, they're already rising quite fast. So people who depend on borrowing money to buying a home, and of course that constitutes something like 55% of UK households, and something similar in the US, are going to be hit severely, particularly if they're no longer, if they have to get new mortgages or remortgages at new rates. And that's going to really hit into people's living standards if this situation continues. And it would get worse if the central banks decide to raise interest rates to the latter part of this year, then the situation will continue to deteriorate. And that can be demonstrated because also we can see that the bond rates, government bond rates, are at very high levels now. That's partly because of the spending which Matthew talked about by governments on military spending and running deficits, but it's also due to the inflation situation that investors in government bonds have a fixed rate. You get a fixed rate on when you buy a bond. If you buy a bond for, say, like you take a national savings certificate in the UK, but if you buy a bond, say for £1,000, and the interest rate is 4%, that's what you'll get, 4%. You'll get £4 on your, or your £40 on your £1,000 the 4% rate. That doesn't change. You'll get your £40. But when you want to sell that bond, if the price of that bond has dropped away because nobody wants to hold bonds anymore because the interest rate is fixed, it can't move up with inflation, then you find you have to sell it at 900, you lose £100. So bond investors are worried about buying bonds with fixed rates because they're going to lose money on inflation when they have to sell them. So, well, there's a serious situation now in government bonds, and that reflected also in other bond yields. So we have a situation now where if this economic situation continues with the war and all the other underlying pressures that have been on inflation as well and the economy, then we're going to move to a position where a sizable section of average households and below are going to be losing their living standards already in the case of the UK and other countries, which have been stagnant now for more than a decade since the Great Recession of 2008-9. And some economists describe this as a K-shaped economy. What do they mean by that? Well, they mean that at the top 10%, the top 1% are doing fine, thank you very much. They're getting increases in income from top jobs. Chief executives of companies are raking it all in. They're getting also some very large increases in their stock market ownership. So they own a lot of shares, which the very, very, very top people do, rather than property. They own their property as well, but if they also own shares and bonds and things of this nature, which financial assets, which can produce a considerable increase in value and in income, then they're doing fine. Everybody else who doesn't have that. So if you take the US, for example, the US stock market has been booming in this situation while the Iran war has been on, while the Ukraine war has been on, while economies have been slowing down, while inflation's been picking up. Why is the American stock market booming? Well, in the case of an immediate situation, it's booming because people think that the war is going to be over. The investors in the US think the war is going to be over. They keep hoping and believing that Trump is right, that the whole thing is going to be sorted out very shortly, either the victory for the US or at least a deal which ends the war so they can get on with business as usual. And the other reason is, in the case of the US, that they actually believe they have got, as it were, the secret weapon that's going to transform the US economy: artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence companies are investing mega amounts of money. We're talking about next year, or this year, $600 billion by the major AI companies. By end of next year, it'll accumulate towards $2 trillion, which, given that the US economy is about $30 trillion, you can see that's a sizable proportion of GDP. But more importantly, the US economy is growing at no more than 1%, probably less. So this is a massive reason for the economy growing. It's all concentrated in these AI companies and their investments. And who are they? What are they investing in? They're investing in data centers so that they can collect all the knowledge that the AI machines are supposed to be able to give to us when we prompt them. Try prompting them about the Iran war, see what it might tell you. The data centers will provide this and keep this information flowing. Massive increases in data centers, huge capacity and spending going on in data centers. But the problem is with the AI data centers and the investments that these companies are making is two things. I know I'm talking about AI, but I think it's relevant now for the US in particular. The first thing is that nobody's making a profit on this. They're not even making much revenue on this. People apparently, it's claimed everybody's using AI, Chat GPT, and so on, but only if it's free. On the whole, they're using it just to prompt, a bit like Google, to see what the situation is, to get an AI prompt. But nobody's really using it in business in big time yet. Not in any significant way that would mean, say, replacing lawyers or economists or other people in the knowledge sectors of the economy. That's not really happened yet. Employment is falling, but not particularly because of AI replacing people, but because the economies are slowing down in Europe and in the US. So that's one thing. There's no revenues and certainly no profit coming through. That's not necessarily unusual, because during the dot-com revolution, when we had the internet and so on, and all the things that we now use on this Zoom and so on, in the early 2000s, 1999, 2000, that those companies, 90% of the dot-com companies that were set up went bust. They didn't make any money, but nevertheless, the technology was there, and a few companies became great. The ones that we see now, like Amazon, like Google, like Facebook or Meta, and so on. Now, these big hyperscaling AI companies, there's a whole range of small ones that probably will go bust, but these companies are not making any money. Will they make money enough in time to justify the massive investment that's ahead? We can't say for sure. All I would say is it's like the US economy is this one big bet on AI. Everything depends on AI delivering. Otherwise, the US economy is going to join the rest in a major slump. We're almost certainly going to have a stock market slump and crash, but whether we'll have an economic recession and slump will depend on whether these sectors of the economy, AI, actually deliver an increase in productivity and, above all, in the profitability of US industry. That remains uncertain and undecided. But stock market investors in the US believe it, and they believe that investment's massively increasing, so they're jumping on the backs of the AI hyperscalers in order to take advantage of increased stock market prices. So if prices go up, they can sell and make more money. It's a speculative process, and that's what they're relying on. They're hoping that this will continue, this gravy train will continue, and that's why the stock market is, in the US alone, is shooting upwards as a result of the AI bet. That may well come to an end in the near future, but at the moment, it's driving the confidence, at least amongst the sectors of the American finance capital, that it will work and that they will be able to establish a new economy based on AI productivity and profitability. The other thing is, of course, as Matthew mentioned, the huge spending that the US government and other governments are planning now to make in military weaponry, armaments, and armed forces. The NATO is pledged, thanks to Donald Trump, to increase spending by governments to 5% of GDP from around about under 2% at the moment. That is a huge increase, nothing seen like that since the Second World War, over the next 5 to 10 years. However, each country has got its own timetable for that. So apart from the $1 billion a day that the Americans are spending on the Iran war, they're also increasing their budget for military spending to 1.5 trillion next year. A 50% increase Donald has made in order to meet all the commitments that American imperialism is making around the world. And this is an increasing burden for American imperialism and its public finances, but also, if it doesn't deliver anything in terms of control around the world, it will just be a loss for the US economy and also for US imperialism. And that brings me to the second half of what I want to say, which is what we're looking at now. The Iran war is an example of US imperialism being forced to go in a certain direction for regime change, for control of the world through military activity, not even financial now. It's done financial sanctions and so on, which we discuss when it comes to other countries. But now it's increasingly trying to impose its will through military power. Reminds me a bit of the Roman Republican Empire, which reached a certain level of success through a slave economy. The US has become the prominent success in capitalism, but now it's in relative decline. The Roman Empire entered relative decline, and the slave economy of the Roman Empire only continued through continual military conquest and defense of the existing gains. And that increasingly appears to be the only answer that the American ruling class can offer, because they are faced with a complete change in the 21st century from the omnipotence that they had after the Second World War, which was won mainly in the interests of the US. They gained the most out of that, reducing the UK to a junior partner and to Europe to a supplicant to begin with for American exports and so on. And then, as the century went on, we saw eventually the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, which placed the US as the sole hegemonic power in capitalism towards the end of the 20th century. But that is no longer the case, as we know. We now, in the 21st century, we've seen the rise of China in an absolutely dramatic and unprecedented way as a rival economic power to the US. The US originally looked to see China as a massive place for improving profits for US multinationals, an economy with a population of over 1 billion back in the 1970s that they saw would be a tremendous surplus labor which they could use to develop American capitalist industries. There was a huge investment by American manufacturers. We know all the hyperscalers before anyway, but if we talk about the hardware people like Apple and Microsoft and so on, and the car industries of Europe and the US all plunged into China after the détente with Nixon and Mao in the late 70s, and then by the opening up of the economy in the late 1970s by the Deng leadership in China. And so we had engagement, and this culminated in the World Trade Organization accepting China as a member in 2001, which meant that China now had free opportunity to send all its manufacturing exports into the rest of the world without tariffs and restrictions by joining the WTO, because they would be part of the rules order of the WTO. And that American manufacturers supported that. The World Bank, I remember they made a big report about how that was a great news, because they thought that this would mean that American manufacturing would now dominate in China and we could use Chinese labor to expand. But that hasn't turned out to be the case, because what has happened is the Chinese state has kept control of foreign enterprises, of the share of value being created in that country, and has maintained a very high level of state sector and state-directed investment, which has meant that the foreign-owned companies, although they export a lot and still do so, they don't have control over what happens in the economy, and they certainly don't have control over the political events that take place. So that culminated in the Great Recession of 2008-9, when all the major capitalist economies went into a major slump. 90% of the world's economies went into slump. If you look at the data figures, virtually all countries had a fall in their GDP in 2008-9, except one, or actually two. One, which was China. China did not have a fall in GDP. It had an increase in GDP. And the other country was Australia. And why was that? Because Australia exported all its minerals and resources to China, who sucked them up. So Australia became a sort of a supplicant to Chinese growth, and in many ways has continued to do so until fairly recently, when the current Australian government regime wants to decouple from China because it's under orders from Trump to do so. But engagement with China, namely controlling China through imperialist companies, has given way after that to containment. We must destroy China. We must strangle China. We must drive it down, not give it the power to spread its influence around the world, and try to control its exports, its manufacturing prowess. That has so far failed. Far from China is just producing toys and low-value products. They still produce. I think probably everybody in this watching this Zoom is probably either wearing or got something in the house made by China that isn't high technology, whether it's clothing or whatever. But also now they will probably have something that's got high technology as well. In fact, the computer I'm using is made by the Chinese. So this is the development of middle range value, but we now are seeing the high value technology of semiconductors and chips that compete with the major chip manufacturers now in the US, like NVIDIA, and also in AI, where we've seen number of AI models coming out of China now for free at cheap prices to produce that can undercut the expensive ones that the Americans are producing themselves. This situation, as far as America is concerned, cannot continue. So what's the policy to be adopted now by the American imperialism, which relates to what we've been talking about with Iran? As far as I'm concerned, there are two wings now to American imperialist policy. Firstly, there is the old policy, which is the globalist, we might call that. The idea is that America still should be dominant around the world. It should decide all the issues of the world. It should use the UN to do so. It should support the Ukrainians in the war against Russia. It should continue its campaign to decouple and strangle and sanction China. These are policies adopted by the Biden administration and by the Bush administration before that, and that they should take on the Middle East if necessary, in Iraq, and in Afghanistan and so on, that they should be the policemen of the world. They should restrict and reduce any opposition, including China as well. This globalist policy, which used to be called the Washington Consensus, the consensus in Washington about what to do, under Trump has given way to a new policy. Under Trump, too, we have Make America Great Again. And in the national security document produced by the Trump administration recently last year, they said the aim is no longer to control the world. We're not interested in controlling the world directly, at any rate. What we want is control of the Western Hemisphere. We want to restore what is called the Monroe Doctrine. James Monroe in the early 1800s, one of the American presidents, said that the aim of American capitalism as it developed in the 1820s was that they would concentrate on protecting the Western Hemisphere for themselves. And the Europeans and the Japanese and the others could stay away, the Spanish in particular, because we want Mexico and all the rest of it. Latin America, South America was America's. And once we had that, then that's our policy. Donald has now revived Monroe Doctrine, which basically says, yes, Western Hemisphere is what we want to be. That's where America is going to be. That doesn't just mean South America or Central America. That means Canada. Canada should be annexed, should become part of the US. And of course, Greenland should be bought so that we can use the resources. And once we have that nice America great again on the external front, we can then go towards the Pacific, as American has always done in the past, cross the Pacific, owns all those bases already, Hawaii, Guam, from the Second World War, and we can move not this time to Japan, who has already become a supplicant of the United States, but of course to strangle and isolate China, perhaps build up Taiwan in order to provoke the Chinese into mistakes and so on. That's the Monroe Doctrine at the moment. But the globalists do not accept that being sufficient. The globalists still dominate in the CIA, in the State Department, amongst most of Congress.
How much longer do you want to go?
Sorry?
How much longer do you want to?
2 minutes.
2 minutes. Okay, great.
I'm enjoying myself. Not only do they want to dominate, they want to continue to dominate the world, and they look in also not just to winning the war in Ukraine, whatever, but also to controlling the Middle East, and backed very strongly by Israeli funding and support. The Israeli globalist network is closely linked and organized within Congress and the Senate. And those forces, on the whole, seem to be dominant. Now, Donald Trump is, as we've just come back to arguing about, is a totally illogical, insane person. And so he swings from one side to the other. Apparently, he wants to make America great again with tariffs, with industrial policy, and concentrating on the Western Hemisphere. And the next day, he's supporting wars in Ukraine, in Iran, and elsewhere, because the globalists have still got in his left ear or his right ear their ideas, and they wish to continue that. So we now have a situation as we go towards the end of this month, where we have a war in Iran, which, as Matthew said earlier, is totally illogical from the point of view of American imperialism, because they're not achieving regime change. They're not achieving control of the Middle East. Even the Israelis are having to admit that they're taking quite a lot of cost out of this. It's not just monetary cost, but also weapons have been lost. They're not controlling the regime in Iran. The situation has got one step too far for this policy of globalism. Trump probably regretting that he didn't stick to MAGA rather than the globalist policy. But now he's left in the lurch. He's left holding this situation where he cannot find an answer to whether this war can end. And if this war doesn't end fairly soon, then, as we've discussed already, we are heading towards a serious economic situation globally, rising prices to levels we haven't seen for some time before, inflation rates, stagnation in the major economies, and probably slumps in some of them. And it could be combined with a collapse in the great AI investment bubble in the US. That's the prospect for the second half of this year, unless this war is quickly resolved. There you are, Matthew, have done it.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. That's a very comprehensive survey of the state of the world. So there must be a whole list of people who want to make some comment on this. Ian.
Yeah. On implications for other countries, other major countries in the world, and on something that you've just written about, Michael. I saw that you had an article called "India: A Further Turn to the Right" about the latest local elections there, which was pretty disappointing. That Modi seems to be again moving forward after the last general election. Seemed to be a bit of a setback for him, if anything, lost his majority. And given that on this platform at Win, there's been discussions of various uprisings on the subcontinent apart from in India itself. So I was wondering if the economic consequences of the war was in any way responsible for that. It seemed a little counterintuitive that after 12 years this was still turning that way, or indeed if future economic consequences could cut across it. So yeah, just a quite specific question for now on something else you've written about, but in context of this.
Okay, thanks, Conrad. Nobody else? I would say, myself, I think the interesting about this war, of course, is it's not clear really why you would start it. The thing about the American military has always war gamed this one, and every time they come up with a position, well, Iran will seize the Straits of Hormuz, and there's no way we can shift them, and therefore they've always been. And among the also, of course, the question of the fact that they don't have the resources to attack a country of 90 million people. The US military has always come out with a policy against a war against Iran. They've been quite consistent. You can go back over particularly the sayings of retired officers who are the usual spokespeople for this. And the problem, I think, there's two things. One, that Trump has actually got rid of most of the people in places like the State Department and so on. And of course, he doesn't agree with or listen to the CIA. However much I disagree with the CIA, he doesn't actually. So therefore, the actual analysis on the basis, and the military even. The thing is, one of the things Hegseth has done is it's fired a great number of officers. So you wind up with people who do what they're told. So then you wonder, the one thing that seems to have prompted all this is a presentation by Netanyahu to Trump saying that this can be done.
Yeah.
Therefore, if you strike this and you kill these people, then everything will change. Now, after that came out, Mossad itself said, we don't agree with this. This is crap. Senior Mossad people, I don't know if they were current or previous, but people who knew the thing just said, well, this is crap. They're making it up.
Well, I mean, I think you're right, Matthew. That appears to be what the news sources are telling us, that the Israelis convinced Trump, and no doubt with and Mossad in particular, no doubt with all the other support that they've got in Congress and in the State Department, such as it is, and the CIA and so on, saying to them, look, you did it in Venezuela, can we do it again in Iran? No problem, doesn't matter. Quick wipe out of Mullah, and they did a very, and as they point out, very successful assassination job. They got in there and killed just about, I don't know how many they killed. Some people say 100 top leaders in one day. Victory! Well, here we are, 3 months later, no victory. And now we can say, well, this is an illogical stupidity. They shouldn't have done this. But they obviously believed, or at least Trump believed, or was persuaded by the Israelis that this was going to work. And as far as the Israelis are concerned, they don't care. They just want to go on and on and on until Iran is reduced to Syria or reduced to Libya or whatever.
The problem is also that you wind up in a situation that, because the Israelis always have this notion that they can just assassinate people, everybody who actually faces the Israelis always makes sure they have multiple numbers of people who can take over any job in case somebody gets knocked off. that process has gone. Anyway, Finn.
Yeah, I want to thank Michael for a very, very good opening contribution. So I want to begin by asking a question now. I know you dealt with this in your opening contribution for this relates to the stock market. There's a huge increase in gains being made by investors in the US stocks. And each day in the Irish newspapers, there are reports of the London Stock Exchange, the European exchanges, and elsewhere. And they're all suffering other than the US.
Yeah.
So the expectation of making profit in the future would be as true of the London Exchange as of New York. So why is it that the people who invest in the US stocks expect things going to work out okay, whereas people who invest in the UK stocks are a little bit worried and a little bit dodgy? And I find it problematic that they're not idiotic people. They're trying to make money for themselves. And there's a link between, as you've explained, the bond market and the stocks. But nonetheless, the bonds are facing crisis, whereas stocks are making gains. I'm just not sure why it applies in the way you've explained it. You've explained it very well. I'm not arguing about your explanation, but I find it a bit of a problem, difficult to explain. The second point I want to raise is in relation to the class struggles in the various countries. The US, obviously, Iran, all the countries of the Middle East, including Israel, because the resolution of this problem won't be achieved militarily, because we stand for a ceasefire immediately, an unconditional immediate ceasefire. And there's an expectation, it's a bit fantastic expectation, but there's an expectation that somehow US is going to lose militarily. But that's not the way sources approach a war. War is a barbaric exercise and should cease. And we need to put a lot of emphasis on that and not allow the illusion to spread that the US, or for that matter Israel, can be militarily defeated. That's not an issue, and we need to face that and state that as well. The resolution is in the class opposition. So other comrades or yourself, Michael, or someone else might be able to explain how a class movement would emerge in America. Now, it's not like the Vietnam War. Like 58,000 US people, servicemen, died in the Vietnam War. I think that's the figure, as I remember. The situation in Iran is different, so that won't be the basis for it. But there's a lot of opposition in America. For example, the No King. Now, it's not a very wise slogan. I don't agree with that type of slogan. It's a bit academic and a bit abstract. But the movement around that slogan represents opposition to Trump, right across the country, not just on the issue of war, which people are opposed to, but also on the issue of living standards. So the demand for no king, even though it sounds a bit abstract, the movement behind it really is a class movement. And we need to see how that can solidify around a concrete opposition that would overthrow the Trump regime, replace the Democrats as the opposition, and create a real opposition across society. And I think the No King, the opposition to the ICE movement, the as it was at the time, the Black Lives Matter, which was taken over by the Democrats, or handed to the Democrats actually. But these kind of movements might coalesce and give rise to a real class opposition that would replace the Democrats. Now we need to spend time discussing and thinking about that. But the same is true in Israel. Even though Israel has a unique position in the globe in terms of its military prowess and across the Middle East, and it operates as a client state of the US in the Middle East, even though all that is true. Nonetheless, the working class in Israel are like the working class anywhere else. In fact, Israel is the most class divided, one of the most class divided societies in the world. And the settlers and these people, the reason they're given all these land that belonged previously to Arabs is because people can't afford to live in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or the main cities. So the regime says, listen, tell you what, go and take some of this Arab land and build a house out there and you get all kinds of grants and supports. But nonetheless, class opposition in Israel, we have to spend time thinking and working out how that might emerge politically. And there must also be, even though it might sound a bit abstract at this stage, unity between, for example, the Egyptian working class, the Lebanese working class, the Israeli working class in a common struggle against the role of capitalism in the Middle East. So we need to spend time discussing how these things might emerge, because that's the only way in which the solution can be found to this crisis. And if comrades have ideas on how that might emerge, and by the way, the same is true for other countries. The opposition to the economic crisis, which is emerging from the war, should really be directed in a class direction to help the movement to this. So it's not just against the economic consequences of the war, but it's against the capitalist regimes in these countries as well, such as Germany, the UK, and places like that. So thank you again, Michael, for a very comprehensive and very informative, open contribution. And well, these are my questions. Anyway.
Okay, thanks, comrade. Roger. You're muted, Roger.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, I completely echo what Vin said about the really absolutely clear opening contribution by Michael. Some, explaining some quite complicated and difficult situation in a crystal clear way. And I really thank you very much for that. So that's why we keep on inviting you. I would say that the speed of events is absolutely stunning. When you think of it, it's only just over 3 decades ago, 30 odd years ago, that, as Michael said, that the USA seemed to be absolutely dominant. They were growing at that time with the collapse of the Soviet Union. They were crowing that this was the end of history. I mean, a little bit premature, I think we'd all agree, looking back on what's happened in the subsequent 30 years and the situation now. But that's how it seems. The USA seemed to be absolutely unipolar society. The world was unipolar. America was completely dominant. It could dictate its will across the world, and we see how rapidly that's been completely undermined. Now, I've seen some figures. I mean, I'm a bit amateur on this, and I pick up figures, and maybe sometimes I pick the wrong ones, or maybe they're a little bit askew or something. So I'd like to check these with Michael. But I've seen figures, for instance, in terms of world production, that though America is still by far, according to the OECD, is still the dominant producer in the world and so on. But I've seen figures which, if I've interpreted them right, were by the World Bank, which says if I've got this right, if you monitor the level of world trade on the basis of the real value of the purchasing power of the currencies, I think that's right. They actually put China first. They put China at the top. It's actually already, in other words, the dominant power on Earth. And of the top 5 countries in the world, 3 of them are based in Asia. That's China, Japan, and India. With I think America and Germany, I think is the other one out of the top 5. And that's an absolutely astounding turnaround. I've also seen, by the way, something which amazed me even more, and I'd be very interested to hear what Michael says about this. I saw a figure recently which seemed to be saying that Europe's share of world trade which has slumped very, very fast in the last couple of decades. What I saw was, which seems almost unbelievable, that its share of world trade is now down to the level it was in at the time of the Middle Ages. A complete slump of the European share of world trade, which is a very interesting figure and explains a lot about what's going on, including the massive arms race and the preparations for World War and so on, because of the desperation on the part of, I suppose, particularly the German ruling class and the other ruling classes of Europe too. And then, of course, as far as the USA is concerned, as Michael said, you have this very interesting document produced by the Department of Defense, which is now named the Department of War, which absolutely abandoned the idea of globalization and so on, and which insisted on this the so-called Donroe Doctrine. It actually said in very scathing terms. It's quite amusing. It's quite actually readable. The document, which completely scorns the idea of of trying to dominate the world and trying to fit everything into the American model and to reconstruct things and so on, saying to hell with all that. We must concentrate on the Western Hemisphere. Make America great again. It's America and the Americas. And as you say, what came from that is also we want Mexico, we want the Panama Canal, we want Canada, we want Greenland. All of that would be a kind of mini sector of the world, which would be their patch and abandoning. Now, how do we explain the fact that, on the contrary, that the ink was hardly dry on that document, but Trump immediately was going into these lunatic adventures? Perhaps, first of all, he saw and misunderstood the success he had in Venezuela, where he thought he could just go in, arrest the president, Shanghai him back to a jail in America, and then take hold of the Venezuelan oil. Although I don't think even that has worked as well as they'd hoped. But how is it then that we have this completely capricious, unstable, erratic policy of Trump, just almost overnight, just improvising policies and strategies which come from nowhere, which have got no kind of preparation or defense? And I think there we have to link that to the super concentration of capital, that we now have a few billionaires, a handful of billionaires who dominate everything. And I think the point is that meant a diminution of the old apparatus of the state. They dispensed with diplomacy. They dispensed with strategy. They dispensed with the state machine. You needed to have a bourgeois state machine before, because, as Marx and Engels explained, it was an executive committee of the capitalist class, which had to balance the interests of quite a wide stratum in society. And they needed experts and technicians and strategists who knew how to manage their affairs. But now that you've got when it's just Elon Musk and Bezos and Trump himself and so on, who are the super billionaires who run everything, they say, "Oh, the hell with all that! What do we need all that for? We don't need it." And so actually, we've had a kind of abandonment of the experts of the State Departments and so on, and it's just everything depended on the caprices and whims and delusions of the handful of people who are in charge, and really of the one person who's in charge, and that's Trump. So I think, in a way, you could say that old slogan, or that old saying, "Whom the gods destroy, they first make mad." Now, okay, Trump is probably clinically mad, but at the same time, his madness is not just a personal failing; it's actually representative of the decline and decay of the entire class.
It's method in madness.
Not much method. There's a lot of madness. Anyway, man, you're muted, comrade.
Thank you very much. No, I really enjoyed that, Michael. Thank you. Everybody said it was a thorough talk about different areas. I think there is one thing which is true: the situation of Trump, the situation about the state, the relationship in terms of China's standing. Roger mentioned the PPP. All of these are correct, and the situation. But the main question still comes up to say, why did this war happen now? I think that question is still there, irrespective of all the other questions. I do agree that Israel wanted this war in the region. But the question of, or suggestion that US did not want to change on its own, then goes secondary. I agree that there was a lot of push by Israel. I think that was more of a sidetrack to the idea. If we agree that the great evil or the great competitor of US is China, the issue of hold on energy, the Strait of Malacca, which is coming up next, which is effectively the next step, and all the rest, suggests that US did want, or what you call the globalist side, does want or did want to have further say about the situation of the US in the Middle East. Iran was a choice that was picked up. I tend to think that the US has never ever picked up a person. They didn't pick up Saddam. They picked up Saddam because Saddam was in Iraq. They didn't pick up bin Laden, but they picked up Afghanistan. They found bin Laden. I think the question of geography has always worked, at least in the contemporary 50, 60 years of US. So the question of Iran, because of its geopolitical position, I'm not talking about the oil or Strait of Hormuz, the geographical position, the links that it has had, the corridors that it's actually creating from India to Mid-Asia, etc. Iran was picked up. Then the issue of ayatollahs and theocracy, etc., 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 or even the nuclear issue comes up. So the question that is there is, if you don't look at it this way, it would seem as if there is no decision body, there is no structure, there is no planning. We may disagree with the plan, we may disagree with the strategy, but I think it would give the picture that Trump is haphazard mad, and the whole state and the whole bourgeoisie in US is just driving it, or because Netanyahu talked in his ear, they just suddenly decided, oh, we got to do something about this. I think the whole idea of this war is part and parcel of a structure competition that is happening in the world, of changing from a uni to a multipolar. So this war, the timing of it, or the situation that it occurred in, or the lack of preparation or wrong calculations, etc., are sides, if you like, to the main meal. The main meal is that in competition, even from the donors' point of view, of what they do about Pacific, would have to be identified by the falling power that the US had in Middle East and its essential need to do something about Middle East. That stays. If the Islamic Republic stays in power, that is there. That's why we said this war was never our war. This war had other expectations and other things. Secondly, it has had an impact. I think some comrades did mention, and you mentioned it as well. it has had some impact. If you consider it from the position that the US has and the position that the bourgeoisie in all of the Middle East have, one issue was in terms of alternatives. The alternative security strategy that right now Putin and Xi have both talked about it in harmony, that they want something for the whole region rather than specifically about the Strait of Hormuz. That's a big deal. But in terms of the class struggle that is taking place there, because of the role that the US has played and because of the states in the area that all have had a role and the deep hatred of the situation vis-a-vis that comes to be US pushing for it, it has had an impact. On one hand, the Islamic Republic now seem in the popular idea that this is the one who stood up against Israel as a proxy of US and therefore of US. That's number one. Number two, the situation means the impact on it has on the working class struggle, that there is no way you can do anything because the greater powers, regionally or internationally, can have an impact outside your control. So making the working class there feel that we can't actually stand against Israel anywhere, but there has to be alternatives coming from outside. So putting this all together, what I'm trying to say is, in Iran, for example, we have had 8 years of Iran-Iraq war. And the working class and the class struggle came out after that. This war, obviously, the class struggle will continue. It has taken a hit back. But in terms of the whole area, the impact of this war, irrespective of the outcome, at the moment, does not show a solution for the bourgeoisie, whether in US or whether in the Middle East. So the question is, what do we do in terms of the working class there to oppose this halt, or if you like, this pause that they enforced on the class struggle because of the bombing? Hence the idea of immediate end. That's where it comes from. The idea of whether it is possible or not is one thing, but it's like saying the working class wants socialism. The question is how and what you do to make it possible. Identifying the strategy is the issue, rather than the possibility of its implementation right now. That is where the idea of the war comes through. That's it. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Alan. Anybody else?
John's got his hand up here.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of America and what do they call it? Unintended consequences. Now, I'm not talking about what's happening in the Gulf or what have you, because I think that's been covered very well. But the two things that strike me as having unintended consequences, one is Elon Musk deciding that to cut US aid, I think that was the name of the program, which largely affected Africa. Now, what we have in Africa is now a situation where we have a disease that's been known about for some considerable time. Ebola has no, if you like, vaccines available. Vaccines were available for, what do they call it, COVID, within 2 years, a disease that nobody had heard of, although there were precursors to, COVID. We have the situation where at the time of COVID, I heard a report saying that one of the most dangerous things that was happening was the fact that the tundra in the not very far northern hemisphere was thawing out at an alarming rate. And it was reckoned by certain scientists that there were huge areas of, what do they call them, viruses locked into the tundra, and all that was needed was one or two of them to be like, COVID, to cause an absolute catastrophe for the world. And what you've got in America is this anti-woke, as they call it, program that foreign aid is a load of rubbish, that money's better spent in the hands of billionaires rather than, getting Africa into some form of healthy governance situation, where you've got in the Eastern Congo at the moment an absolute nightmare, where there is so many paramilitaries, it's unbelievable, where there's a coming and going, where all the borders are porous and people are getting Ebola. Ebola's reckoned to have a death rate of 1 in 3. You have the situation where global warming is a big joke, according to the American leadership, and that is having the worst effects in the far north, in the Arctic Circle, which is, if you like, thawing out twice or 3 times as fast as the rest of the world. And what I'm saying is that the Americans now are in a position of just being able to turn off and on, to threaten to bomb Iran back to the Stone Age, which they'd be capable of doing with Israel. Bombing, I mean, they bombed universities, they bombed steel mills, they bombed bridges, an absolute reckless approach, where the UN now, for what it was worth, is absolutely impotent in doing anything. And it's just this nonsense of unintended consequences that the leadership in America is wreaking havoc on the rest of the world. And there is, if you like, no check or balance. Social democracy, I wouldn't say is dead, but it's on its death throes. We can see the nonsense that we've got in Britain at the present time, with the rise of reform and all the rises in Europe of different, if you like, right-wing groups. So I just thought I'd throw that in as part of the mix that we're in at the moment. It's not just the Strait of Hormuz, but the whole chaotic world situation that we're in. I'll leave it at that, comrades. I hope it makes some sense.
Thanks, Corey. Okay. Michael, do you want to say anything about what's been?
Yes, just a few things for the next half hour for 50 minutes. No, I'm exaggerating. India, I think it's an important point to make. I did a post a month or so ago on the Indian regional elections, which led to Modi's party dominating in areas that it hadn't dominated before. But that, if you like, was the peak of Modi's political power, I think, because that was just before the impact of the Iran war on India. And the Iran war impact has been significant on India now, because it imports an awful lot of energy, mainly from the Middle East, and it also imports fertilizer for its Indian farmers. And these things are really hitting the economy badly, cost of living up sharply. Modi has tried to subsidize this to some extent, but that's eating into government spending. The rupee, the Indian currency, has fallen quite sharply as a result of the worry about the Indian economy not turning out to be another China, but turning out to be just another big economy affected by the unintended consequences that Dominic was talking about for other parts of the world. So the irony of that post is that while it showed Modi taking control of areas that never done before, the dominance of the Modi party and regime shows that it's got a limitation, that the world economy is affecting India in a big way, and this Iran war is reducing Modi's success by the day, unless this war comes to an end. So keep your eye on the situation in India, because that mood is for support for Modi will undoubtedly suffer, just as Trump's support has suffered as the result of the Iran war. Which actually brings me to the point that was made by Finn, that we have to look at what the implications are politically for the United States, that we now know that Iran has been an extra impetus for decline in Trump's popularity, even from the very beginning of his his second term, the introduction of tariffs and the increase in prices and in hitting the manufacturing sector has had an impact upon support for Trump, and this has led to a decline in his popularity. The Iran war has guaranteed that. Trump's popularity, according to the polls, is the lowest of any sitting US president ever. That's an indication of the development that's taken place in the recent period, and that is something which is also reflects the now opposition, significant opposition within Trump's own support, the MAGA supporters who are not in favor of this war, who see this as a break from the Monroe Doctrine or making America great again, concentrating on building up American manufacturing, shouldn't be engaging in all sorts of wars around the world as a result. But as Aman said, it appears that all this talk about the Monroe Doctrine and concentrating the Western Hemisphere goes out the window in 2 seconds. And then part of the reason for this, I think, is, as he says, that that there is, well, I would argue there's 2 wings to the American ruling class's policies at the moment. There is the wing which says that we must continue with the world domination that we've seen in the past period since 1950s and onwards and from the 1990s, that we mustn't step back from that, and that the Middle East is a vital part of where America must control things. It's not just a question of the Israelis in our ear, but also a sector of the American ruling class in the state machine, which still exists and has had an influence on Trump. And because Trump is mad, one night he's a globalist, the next night he's a MAGA supporter, and the next night, well, who knows? But he doesn't stick to any particular strategy at all. He has no strategy. His strategy is whoever's talked to him the most recently, whether it's Netanyahu, whether it's Rubio, whether it's Hegseth, whether it's the coterie of American billionaires that Roger has talked about, these plutocrats that now decide the policies of the American administration outside of any of the so-called experts. I mean, if you read the economic studies and papers and the political journals and institutes, they're really shocked. They're the experts. They should be advising Trump on what to do, and they're completely out of it. It's all a question of whether you happen to have been a MAGA supporter from the past period and a TV presenter, and now you can say what you like to Trump, or whether you are have a position which enables you to adopt the policy of globalism which is around. So the result is that we have a completely fragmented, uncertain policy on the part of the American administration, but this is losing Trump massive support. What will be can there be a change in the United States? Well, it's clear that as we head towards the midterm elections, which are now only, about 6 months away, that if the popularity opinion polls are correct, then the Democrats are going to take control of Congress in November, and that would mean at least some changes on the policy. I mean, the Democrats are the globalists extraordinaire, but on the other hand, they're also opposed to a lot of the policies that Trump's adopted and so on, and that's going to bring some changes, and they're going to clip the wings to some extent of Trump's ability, particularly internally within the US, on the question of the policies that Finn was talking about with the ICE and the rest of it, that we're going to see some changes if the Democrats take control of Congress. Of course, it's still possible. The Republicans are trying to gerrymander the constituencies so that that doesn't happen. But it seems at the moment that probably that Trump will not be able to avoid that disaster politically for him. And I think that might provide some impetus for working class, independent working class action in the US when they can see that there's a possibility of change and controlling Trump. Because the economic position is that what I talked about as a K-shaped economy, that the increasing wealth and income going just a very small minority of people against the rest of the American population will increase the the economic drives behind American workers and their families to do something about this situation. To some extent, it's happened already in various parts of the new industrial parts of the American economy, but of course it's minimal compared to what would really be needed to change that. But I think the Iran war is only going to create a much more difficult position for the current administration and for the policies in general of the ruling class, and that will open up some avenues for change and recovery by the American working class. And I think a man was making a sort of a similar point about Iran, that this war has not led to Iran's destruction or the regime's destruction, but it still leaves the economy in an absolutely shocking state, with severe destruction of the economy taking place, infrastructure that's going to require massive change, cost of living has dramatically increased in Iran, and working people in Iran will want something done about this. And the regime really will not be able to, as it not in the past been able to, do much about that to change that situation. Their solution, if they can't change it, has been repression. This time, they're facing a much more difficult position if they try to adopt severe policies of repression. So there are possibly unintended consequences out of the Iran war, which we haven't thought about, which might be beneficial to the working class in both those countries. Can I just say something about the stock market? I just mentioned the stock market. Why is the stock market in the US doing so well and nowhere else? Well, the reason is that the US economy is a bit better than Europe and Japan, which are basically in stagnation, particularly Europe, where inflation is picked up along with stagnation. So we have stagflation. In the US, we have similar symptoms, but not as bad yet. The US is still growing at about 2% a year, as opposed to Europe, 1% or below, or Japan 1% or below, or Canada 1% or below. So it's growing a little bit better because it's got huge investments in AI, where everything depends on that. And its inflation rate is it's rising. It's not rising as fast as it's rising in Europe or even in Japan, where we've seen inflation for the first time in 40 years. So the US appears a slightly better economy as far as the ruling class and the investors are concerned. And also they have this hope about AI transforming the US economy into a dominant position, again, worldwide. But as I don't think that's going to happen. I don't think AI is going to transform the US into a dominant economic power again. I don't think it'll succeed, partly because China can do just as well on the AI front as the US can do, if not better. And even Europe will be able to take advantage if there's anything comes out of that, and it could be some time ahead before it does so. So that we have a position where, as Roger was saying, US was dominant, hegemonic power after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But now its position economically is not so dominant, relatively weaker compared to where it was in the 1990s. Now, on the figures, yes, if we use purchasing power parity, which is in effect measuring the GDP by how much you can buy in that country. So if you're in China and you've got a lot of dollars, what can you get for your dollars compared to what you can get in the US? And you can get a lot more for the same product. You get more of the same product for your $1 than you can get in the US. So on purchasing power parity, the Chinese GDP is much higher than it appears if you just measure it in terms of dollars internationally. And it's even higher, according to the World Bank, the total GDP of China, than the US. But having said that, actually, I've even seen figures where it's even higher. But having said that, China is 1.4 billion people. The US is 350 million people. So GDP per person is not the same. GDP per person is only 25-30% of the US economy. And even despite inequalities, massive inequalities in the US, the average American household is better off than the average Chinese household by some way. Perhaps more importantly, from an economic point of view, the productivity levels in the US are way higher. Productivity growth in China has been dramatically increasing over the last 40 years, but it's still only 30% of US productivity levels. US industry, commerce, and so on is much more, its population, its labor force is much more productive per person than in China so far. But the gap is closing. This is the point. The gap is closing fast, and that's what worries the American ruling class, that gap is closing, and it's closing in areas which they're really worried about, like technology, semiconductors, manufacturing, high quality manufacturing, not in the areas they were never worried about, which was, toys, clothes, and stuff like that, which they didn't want to produce themselves anyway. And now the motor industry, electric vehicles, China dominates the world in electric vehicle production and sales everywhere except in the US, where Chinese EVs are banned. But everywhere else, including Britain, it's dramatic. I saw the figures for the Chinese EVs in Britain in the last year. It's just rocketed. Why? Because China's EV manufacturers are offering very high quality vehicles at more than 25 to 30% priced less than the average German or American vehicle. Americans are nowhere on EVs. Yes, petrol-driven cars still exist, but it's dramatically changing. So China is dominating. It's dominating in solar production and in wind production. As Trump said, we don't need windmills, as he put it. So we don't need wind. So the Chinese are producing wind and they can't sell, which is nonsense. Chinese are selling wind equipment all over the world, and they're dramatically increasing that. And solar equipment, and batteries, they dominate the battery world market, and they have all kinds of other products too, which is not possible. So where does the US is still ahead by some distance when it comes to productivity, but they're losing ground all the time. So they're forced to look at other areas where they dominate. Finance, they still dominate. The US dollar is still the dominant currency in the world. Most governments keep most of their money in US dollars. They're reducing it to some extent, but it's still mostly in US dollars. Most trade and financial transactions take place in US dollars. It's declining, but not anywhere near. The US dollar is still dominant. And the US dollar is only printed by one country, and that is the US government. So the US still has a very big financial power internationally. And of course, the military. The US military spends more on its military than the rest of the world put together, including China. It is a massive military power, which it seems is not quite so successful as it thought it would be in the modern warfare, but nevertheless, it remains a major military power. So the US is not going to disappear. It's not going to collapse. It's not going to be a second power. It's still going to be the dominant power, but it faces a challenge in the next 10 years, which it seems determined to deal with at all costs and at the expense of the rest of us. In the meantime, Europe, as Roger says, has dramatically fallen in its ability to provide an alternative power in the world. I just did a quick figure. Europe's share of world GDP is 13%. Back in the Middle Ages, it was about 7%. So it's not quite as bad as the Middle Ages, but it was at 25% in the period of up to the 1980s. So this is a dramatic decline in Europe, and it's accelerated in particular since the Great Recession, since the Ukraine war, and now the Iran war. Europe is in a terrible state, and it's not on the ability to change that picture. All it can do is flail around, complaining about the cost of energy and so on, which is it's like slitting your own throat and then complaining you've got blood coming out of it. That's the result of that process. When you have leaders in Europe, like Kaja Kallas, who said that China is a disease and a cancer that must be cut out, that's an indication of where the European leaders are thinking when it comes to dealing with the world events at the moment. So there we have a situation where the intensity of conflict between the major sectors in the world will continue, but particularly between the US and China.
Okay, thanks, Roman. I would say you're right, particularly EVs. some years ago, Ford bought up a load of Chinese EVs and tried to disassemble, took them apart and couldn't understand the technology, which I suspect is part of the reason why they were banned from the US. There's such a technological advantage. Anyway,
no, because they've got secret spying things inside them. You see, Matthew.
Yes, of course. Patrick, sorry. You're muted.
Thank you. Yes, I think I should be unmuted now, I hope. Thank you again also, Michael. It was very, very interesting. I wanted to come back on a couple of little things. Actually, Roger quoted those World Bank figures. I think I thought when I first saw those figures that I wasn't so surprised by China being number one, but more by, according to those figures, the biggest European economy now is Russia,
Yes.
ahead of Germany, which I think is far more interesting and something which I've never heard yet or read yet. I still read German newspapers almost every day online. I lived in Germany for more than 30 years, and the Germans, as I knew them when I worked with them, would have been shamed by the idea that Russia could be a bigger economy than Germany, which says an awful lot about what's happened in the last very recent past. If it's true, if these figures are accurate in some way. But I think it's also interesting.
Remember that Russia has double the population, though.
Yes, it has a much bigger population. It's the biggest country in the world. It has enormous resources. And right now, of course, it's benefiting very directly from the increase in oil prices. And I find it quite amusing that even the British, the most Russophobic of all the Europeans, apparently now are offering the Russians to lift the sanctions on Russian oil exports and so on, because of the crisis in the Middle East. But what I was wondering is also the significance of, in military terms, of this relative strength of Russia. We've seen, I think, in the Ukraine war, from a purely military point of view, the strength of the Russian military. Yesterday, we had another of these hypersonic missile attacks on Kiev. This is technology which China and Russia both have, which I believe the USA does not yet have. And the whole question of asymmetric warfare, which again is related to the economy, where you have the Houthis, the so-called Houthis in Yemen, apparently defeating the US in the Red Sea, where at the moment, Iran, one of the reasons they cannot clear the Straits of Hormuz is because of this very new asymmetric warfare with drone warfare technology, where you have these massive warships, aircraft carriers from the US with 6,000 sailors on board, which are completely unable to come within about 800 kilometers of the coast of the Straits of Hormuz. And you have Iranian drones, partly self-developed, apparently, at very low cost, a few $1,000s, able to keep these massive multi-billion ships away from the Straits of Hormuz. And what I wanted to say about Russia and the proxy war between the US and Russia in Ukraine, where you had effectively between 2014, after the coup in Ukraine and the beginning of the Ukraine war, effectively you had the biggest Western European or non-Turkish NATO army in Europe was the Ukrainian army. And it's been, by all accounts, not published, of course, in the Western media, but decimated, completely decimated. Over 1 million dead, most probably in Ukraine. The biggest NATO army in Europe outside of Turkey, decimated by the Russians, who apparently are 3 times more productive in their production of weaponry than the US, than the whole of NATO, including the US. So I think this sort of background, I think very interesting, the relationship between the relative size of the economies, China, number one, but if it's true, then Russia, possibly the biggest in Europe, and the nature of modern warfare, which means that the US, even though, as Michael said, says the US still, of course, is the dominant economic power in the world, is no longer, because of the change in the nature of military warfare, is no longer in the same sort of dominant position, perhaps, that it used to be. The US is because of its geography, it has the two oceans on each coast, which effectively protect it as a land mass. It doesn't need a large land army, and it's relied on its navy in the past and its air force in order to impose its power. But it seems now that the air force has always overstated its power militarily. It's not able to defeat Iran, for example, now through these massive bombing campaigns, or to defeat its atomic program and so on. And on the other hand, as I say, the Navy, the American Navy, is also impotent. And so I don't know. I think there's an interesting background to the world situation. Can I ask Michael just one question, if I may? It seems that in Europe, and I'm in Southeast Asia. I'm between Thailand and China at the moment, in a little country called Laos. And so I see very directly out of my front door, I see the influence of China very directly here where I am. But and one of the main exports, in fact, I think the biggest export that Laos has is actually hydroelectric power to China. I think the Chinese probably built the hydroelectric power systems here, and they buy the power from the little country of Laos. But what I was wondering about, it seems that in Western Europe, or not just in Western Europe, but in Europe as a whole, these right-wing populist parties like the AfD in Germany, like Reform or whatever they call themselves, Coalition, whatever, in the UK, like Le Pen's people in France, in the near future will come to power, come to government at least. I'm wondering Michael, what you think the main economic policies are. I mean, it's all about, it seems to me, it's largely cultural, and of course it's a xenophobic and anti-immigrant movement in all of those countries, or the whole of Europe. It seems to be mainly driven by xenophobia and an anti-migrant sentiment. But that doesn't amount, in my opinion, as far as I can see, to an economic policy. What would you expect if those nationalistic, xenophobic reactionary parties come into government in maybe the very near future, the next 1, 2, 3 years in the UK, in France, in Germany, maybe in other countries as well? What would you expect to be? I mean, we've seen with the Tories and Labour that they're inseparable. There's no difference in their policies. They don't have any answers to the crisis in Britain, very clearly. And I'm wondering, what other policies could these parties actually, economic policies, not just the anti-immigrant and anti-migrant social policies, but what economic policies would you expect them perhaps to, if they have any policies at all? I don't know what they are.
Okay, thanks, Corin.
Yeah. Thank you.
Michael, did you want to answer that briefly?
Well, I think, and it's very difficult to say because they don't publish any economic policies that you can quote. But the gist of it, I think, is when you catch up, for example, on Farage on Reform, or the AfD, or Le Pen, basically their policies, they vary actually from country to country. But the gist of it is something similar to Trumpism, really, which means that first of all, we want government trashed, we want privatization, and we want the welfare spending cut back because it's being usurped by immigrants. They're using up all the immigration, all the welfare spending. So we want a policy where the government only spends for the people of the nation who live there, the white people, not all these others. And so we want the cuts and spending to these elements. We want the expulsion of as many non-white, nationalist people from the country by various methods. This, of course, will seriously damage the economy because these people provide a very important role in contributing towards the GDP and growth and taxation and so on. But that doesn't matter. The policy has to be one where they look towards fundamentally private enterprise and the big companies, because they're talk a lot about, oh, we're fighting against the big people, the government people. But in a reality, they will, just as happened in all the other fascist countries where the people, fascism came to power, that eventually these so-called anti-big people, anti-establishment parties integrated themselves into the corporate structure of capitalism. And that's what will happen. But it will be a policy which I think on the whole will be one of anti-collectivism. So, for example, in the UK, privatising the NHS, national health insurance, American style, following the allowing deregulation of any sort of controls over private equity and private sectors, so they can do what they want, as the Americans, free zones on the ports so that there's no taxation going on. Does this mean there's no money? Well, if there's no money for the government, then we'll cut that out. We'll cut out all welfare and so on. That's the general approach. I don't know if they can stick to a rational strategy. That's another matter, Patrick. They're all over the place. So when it comes, if they do get into position of government, either in some coalitions or on their own, then policies will change on almost a weekly basis, swinging about as they look for ways in which they can sustain their position and popularity. As you say, the concentration will be primarily on cultural repression, on freedom of expression, on rights of people to protest. All those things are going to be crushed. That's what they would aim for. We will have ICE in many parts of these worlds. I mean, the German government already using a form of ICE against immigrants and people who protest. So we will see more of that.
Okay, thanks so much. So I think that, do you want to say something about next week, Roger?
I would like to, but nothing is finalised yet about next week. We're trying to get a report from Comrade Themos in Cyprus. There's just been an important election there. We're still waiting for confirmation. But anyway, watch your emails and you'll get notice of it'll be either that or we'll find something else. Don't worry.
In among everything else that's going on at the moment, yeah. The madness across the globe. Okay, right. Well, thank you very much, comrades, and we shall see you next week, we hope. And hope everybody found that useful.
Thank you, Matthew, and everybody.
Comrades.